Thank you for attending today's webinar. On the behalf of BIS Research, Fujifilm Medical, TransEnterix, and Caresyntax, I would like to welcome you to our webinar on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the minimal invasive surgical technology ecosystem. This is Aditya Singh, Senior Analyst from BIS Research. I will be the moderators for today's event. BIS Research is a global market intelligence firm focusing on various emerging technologies in healthcare industry, such as healthcare robotics, medical imaging, precision medicine, medtech, and digital health. MIS technologies hold the 7th largest contributing share to the global revenue of the medical device market. However, what started as an outbreak in China at the end of 2019, COVID-19 has totally shifted the course of MIS ecosystem. Through this webinar, we are aiming at providing you the business side story on how the impact of COVID-19 is impacting the MIS ecosystem. Today, we are hosting 4 of the finest minds in the MIS industry. Firstly, we have our guest speaker, Mr. Devon, a thought leader known for crafting strategic visions. He held numerous executive level positions over the past 25 years at several world-class organizations such as Olympus Corporation. Currently in Fujifilm, he works as a global vice president of the endoscopic segment and the general manager of the system integration. We also have Mr. Mohan Nathan, who is the Vice President of Global Clinical Marketing at TransEnterix, which is one of the emerging companies in the field of surgical robotics. Prior to TransEnterix, he was associated with Intuitive Surgical and Johnson & Johnson. Third, we have Mr. Timothy Lenz, who is the President at Caresyntax, which is the pioneer in developing the digital technologies for surgical ecosystem. He has more than 20 years of leadership experience in healthcare finance, operations, and technology. We also have our host speaker, Mr. Manu Kaushik Chanda, who is the lead analyst for the healthcare practices at BIS Research. He holds profound experience in market intelligence studies on various healthcare technologies. In the following 60 minutes, we are keen to learn from your experience about how the COVID-19 pandemic has been impacting the MIS technology sector. By the end of this section, we will gain a brief understanding on the MIS ecosystem and how the adoption of advanced technologies will evolve after the end of COVID-19. In today's session, speaker will be focusing on particulars such as impact of COVID-19 pandemic, recovering time of current crisis, opportunities for breakthrough technologies, adoption of digital technologies, role of stimulus packages, and new strategies to minimize the impact. Towards the end of discussion, I will open the panels to audience for questions. Also, I would request everyone in the audience to kindly mute your phone during the session. Thank you everyone for your patience, and let's get us started. The coronavirus outbreak is the first and foremost misfortune that humans have ever witnessed in the World War II. As of July 15, 2020, the world has witnessed nearly 13.7 million confirmed cases, witnessing a recovery rate of 59.53%. Approximately 8.15 million patients have been recovered. However, the coronavirus pandemic has registered a higher mortality rate than compared to that of other diseases, such as Zika virus. The mortality rate witnessed by COVID-19 pandemic was valued to be 4.24% of the confirmed cases. Though restrictions imposed on the economic activities are removed partially, and governments have been proactive in rolling out stimulus packages to avoid the economic downturn. Hence, the revival of economic soundness and the future wealth is still uncertain. As we can notice in the graph, initially all the countries witness exponential growth until they reach the curve's peak. Due to the enforced restrictions, countries have showed initial signs of recovery and drop in total cumulative cases. But the same countries are currently witnessing the second wave of outbreak due to the relaxed restrictions. This proves that the battle against COVID is not yet over, and there exist a significant possibilities for a more intense second wave of COVID outbreak. Now, having understood the seriousness of current crisis, let us investigate the pre-COVID scenario of the MIS ecosystem. I would like to invite Manu from BIS Research to speak upon the same. Over to you, Manu.
Sure. Thank you, Aditya. Reducing the impact of surgical interventions on patients has been the direction of evolution for surgery in the last few decades. The surgical discipline has increasingly shifted from traditional open surgeries to MIS practices, acknowledging the benefits such as low blood loss, low postoperative recovery time, lower possibility for postoperative infections and complications, and above all, lower chance of requirement of revision procedure. MIS technologies have been witnessing impressive growth in demand across the globe till 2019. The global surgical volume for MIS procedures was registered to be 132.2 million in 2019 and is expected to reach 226.1 million by 2030, witnessing a CAGR of 4.54% between the years 2020 and 2030. By 2030, MIS procedures are anticipated to attribute to 46.22% of global surgical volume. Next slide, please. The 132.2 million MIS procedures in 2019 were estimated to yield an annual revenue of $24.76 billion. The emerging surgical robotics segment was noted to contribute to $5.6 billion in revenue, attributing to 22.61% of global MIS market, whereas the conventional MIS technology contributed to the rest. According to 2019 estimates, the market for MIS technology is anticipated to create an incremental opportunity of $28.44 billion during the period 2020 to 2030, witnessing a CAGR of 6.51%. Factors such as growing prevalence of chronic diseases and rise in geriatric population are expected to contribute to the growth. Further, as mentioned earlier, benefits offered by MIS technology are anticipated to bolster the growth of the market. It has been acknowledged that incorporation of MIS surgery would decrease overall cost by 20% to healthcare providers over open surgeries, and also it would reduce the chance for inpatient hospitalizations by 112% for a patient. This is the very reason for MIS elective surgeries being transformed as lifeblood for health hospitals in the past 2 decades. Thank you.
Nearly $28.44 billion of incremental opportunity by 2030 will really make the MIS ecosystem as one of the key areas of focus for both small and multinational companies, and also elective surgeries, which mainly employ MIS technologies, are currently the lifeblood of several hospitals and contribute majorly to their financials. Admitting this, let us understand how did the outbreak of COVID-19 change the course of MIS ecosystem. I would like to invite Mr. Devon from Fujifilm Medical to provide his observations regarding the same. Over to you, Mr. Devon.
Thank you. And thank you to the BIS team for inviting us to participate today. So when we look at the MIS ecosystem is a great way to catch all the different influences that are impacting our MIS business units across the globe. The first thing that we obviously all saw as MIS manufacturers was the immediate reduction in procedures, which was also associated with immediately sales access to the hospitals was shut down. These two things were really driven obviously by patient and staff safety, a lot of which was related to the PPE shortages that we all read about at the beginning of the pandemic. But additionally in the ecosystem, things that we needed to consider was the MIS manufacturer supply chain concerns. A lot of supply chains of core materials were disrupted due to the pandemic, Also related and still going on are the traditional trade shows and society meetings where a lot of intercompany activities are developed, and it's had a tremendous impact on the MIS ecosystem as a whole. So for some more statistics, let's take a look at the next slide here. So elective procedures are a large component, obviously, of minimally invasive surgery. And as this source from LEK Consulting shows, by April, MIS elective procedures were down almost 100%. As we've seen a quick recovery here this summer, you can also see in the outpatient visits, similarly a big impact on the MIS industry and how far down the procedures were in March, April, and then starting to recover in May and June. Johns Hopkins University was quoted as saying that the backlog of elective surgeries for orthopedics is just one example, could take anywhere from 7 months to 16 months to recover. And I know my colleague Tim Lance from Caresyntax is going to talk about the recovery time as well later in the presentation. And through some Fujifilm inquiries at both Cedars-Sinai and John Muir, the current situation is that elective procedures are almost back to normal at 97% and 95% at those two facilities, as just one snapshot of the current situation. So I'll turn it back over to the BIS team now.
Through Mr. Devon's observation, we can notice that COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the MIS ecosystem in all aspects, right from the recurring businesses to the new opportunities. Also, new insight that the overuse of PPE kit by the healthcare workers to protect themselves will also create hindrance for the recovery of MIS surgical procedures. So the next big question will be, what is the impact of changed course of elective surgeries on the MIS technology ecosystem? Manu, can you provide your observation regarding the same? Over to you, Manu.
Sure. Thank you, Aditya. MIS technology ecosystem is one of the foremost fields in the healthcare domain, which witnessed a significant impact due to COVID-19 outbreak. The rollout of regulations that recommended deprioritization of elective surgeries resulted in massive decrease in everyday MIS procedures. According to COVID Surge Collaborative Study, a week of disruption to hospital services would result in a delay of 2.4 million surgeries globally. So in most of the countries, hospitals have been advised to deprioritize elective surgeries. The global MIS procedure volume is expected to be slashed by 40% to drop to 83.1 million in 2020, as you can see on the screen. As we can notice, semi-urgent and non-urgent procedures together contribute to 75% of total surgical volume. They are the procedures that are majorly being deprioritized. However, at the end of May 2020, the MIS ecosystem did witness signs of recovery. This is largely due to the relaxation of enforced restrictions on the elective surgeries. Hence, as we already saw in previous slides, the market is expected to witness recovery soon. Thank you.
Nearly a drop of 40% in procedures is a huge impact. If this would be the scenario due to the outbreak of COVID-19, it is not very comforting to investigate into the few emerging parts of the ecosystem, such as surgical robotics. Surgical robotics is considered as one of the emerging technologies witnessed by the healthcare ecosystem in the 20th century. The year 2020 was expected to be the start of a new era in the history of medical surgeries. So let us invite Mr. Mohan from TransEnterix to provide insight pertaining to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the emerging field of surgical robotics. Over to you, Mr. Mohan.
Thank you. And as well, thank you to the BIS team for the opportunity to speak on this subject. So I think I agree with everything that's been said thus far about the state of the situation. It's obviously quite serious. And I think it's important to start by saying that, again, those of us in the medical technology industry are truly support staff when it comes to the very important work of frontline healthcare workers around the globe. And so a period like this, I think, humbles us in terms of realizing that, you know, we are providing technologies, tools, and training to help them perform their job as best as possible in their jobs have never been more challenging. So just want to acknowledge the real work and the real heroes, if you will. That word gets used too often, but it's true. To your point about surgical robotics in particular, because yes, I agree with that statement that 2020 had a lot of hope and vision associated with this continued growth in robotics. And I thought this was some valuable information provided by Millennium Research Group that just looked at the preponderance of robotic assisted and laparoscopic procedures in the US. You gave some global numbers earlier that still showed MIS as less than the majority of procedures, but obviously growing very quickly globally. But I think in the US and then also to a certain extent in Western Europe and Japan, it's pretty advanced in terms of overall laparoscopic and MIS penetration, but very much so with robotic assisted surgery. So I think it's already been addressed, but a couple things that are certainly the case with robotics. There's a lot of pressure on OR access for clinical and technical support. When you are launching new robotic services and a new robotic program, it is not a tool, it is not a device, it is a program. It has a tremendous impact on all manner of aspects of the hospital, from biomedical engineering to central sterile to nursing to the PAs or first assists or residents that may be involved, and of course the surgeon. So we have we have created a paradigm where there's a lot of very, very highly trained professionals that, as in other areas of medical device, are there to help, support, and train our surgeons. And that's been very difficult from an OR access perspective. However, I want to credit AVIMED for, in the US at least, providing some real good guidance in terms of the process by which we can work together to get back in. And so we're seeing that many of those restrictions have been lifted thoughtfully at different clinical sites around the world, and particularly now also in the US, although I do worry a little bit about the continued surge in cases in certain areas in the US especially having an impact on this. So we're watching it closely. Another aspect of this is when you're talking about robotics, you are talking about significant capital investments for a hospital. And that goes without saying right now that hospitals have their minds on other things. Hospitals in general do not operate with significant margins relative to their overall patient revenue. There's oftentimes many challenges in terms of timing of payments because you provide the service, and then payors, particularly in certain healthcare systems where payment is very disparate, can take a long period of time. So you have to preserve quite a bit of working capital to maintain and fund your operations. And obviously, COVID has really disrupted the security that a lot of hospitals feels in terms of their capital cushion, if you will, to fund working operations. And so what that leads to is a lot of hospitals are thinking very seriously about cash conservation. So even if a program makes 200% sense in terms of ROI and value, there's a real concern to not use up existing capital sources right now, which means that, however, most robotic and capital equipment companies have thought through this, and there's already a significant use of operating lease arrangements, which are essentially rental agreements, if you will, amongst large and small players. And I think that's going to be even further accelerated as a percentage of overall capital placements for the time being because of the COVID impact. A lot has been said about the impact on elective surgeries, immediate and medium term. I will agree completely with my colleagues about what they observed and the data they provided. We saw that firsthand as well. But I would skip to the last point, which is we saw tremendous global and regional differences. And I would say globally, and our business is very involved in Japan, Taiwan, throughout the EU, both Eastern and Western Europe, and certainly the US. And so we have a good glimpse at what's going on kind of across the globe when it comes to minimally invasive surgery and robotics. And a lot of countries, and much has been said in the press about this, so I don't need to belabor it, but many countries have dealt with this with different levels of success. And I would highlight that Taiwan probably, and I think your graph showed this, may be the most successful large country in terms of dealing with COVID and minimizing disruption. And we have multiple hospital sites there where volumes are very active and robust and life continues. So well done. And Japan has had some regional issues, but overall has maintained a pretty robust activity in robotics. And the EU and the US both certainly saw kind of a full stop in April, but Europe is recovering a little faster than the US. But I support what others have said. Robotics is kind of part of the total story in terms of elective surgery. It's a big part of it in the US. So when you talk elective, you're going to talk a certain percentage being robotic. The last thing I would say is one thing that we've noticed with robotics that's been pretty interesting and frankly surprised us was that there would be a rush towards certain robotic surgeries being added back even sooner than other procedures that we may have thought were more urgent. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example like bariatric surgery, where there's a fairly deep penetration of MIS and also robotic assistance. These are patients that many times are treated on an outpatient basis, meaning a 23-hour stay or less. They're not taking up a hospital bed for 2 or 3 or 4 days like you might have with more severe surgeries like colorectal and whatnot. And so hospitals are also trying to generate revenue and cover their costs. And so some of those procedures are actually very valued to be added on back to the schedule quickly because that patient gets treated, oftentimes with robotic intervention. They have a very minimally invasive experience, and they're out of the hospital within 23 hours at usually a good reimbursement. So it's interesting, some of the nuance in terms of what procedures are being highlighted and influenced in terms of restarting. I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
This is really great. As Mr. Mohan presented, though the field of surgical robotics initially did witness a significant decrease in surgical volume and the sales of new surgical robotic platforms. While the restriction on the economic activities are being relaxed, the surgical volumes are gaining its momentum. As a matter of fact, the entire MIS ecosystem is gaining its initial momentum from the start of June. So, noticing that, let us investigate another emerging field, which is data analytics technologies for surgical ecosystem. Let us invite Mr. Timothy from Caresyntax to present his views on the impact of COVID-19 on the data analytical technologies deployed for enhancing the productivity of the surgical ecosystem. Over to you, Mr. Timothy.
Thank you very much, and I'll echo my colleagues in thanking BSI for BIS for having us on this webinar today. And I think we've brought up some great points so far in the webinar that tie very nicely into the impact that analytics is having in this space, related to COVID-19. And I would say the biggest thing that we're looking at right now, or one of the biggest, is really the pressure that COVID has created on the surgical waiting lists. I think Mr. Bream showed a very nice graphic of that dip in surgical volume. And when you take that dip over many months and you look at that on a global scale, it's pretty staggering the amount of backlog and surgeries that have been created in that elective surgery grouping. And this is just a little bit of data coming out of NHS to take the UK as an example. In their system, prior to COVID, they were already sitting at a surgical backlog of about 4.5 million cases, right? And then you add COVID on top of that, and it really exacerbated, an already challenging problem for many countries. And I think NHS is maybe one of the larger ones impacted. But they've done some calculations, and you can see on the right in this slide that to get back to maintenance of their current targets, right, which is basically seeing a certain percentage of patients within 18 weeks to get them in for their cases, they would have to increase their volumes per month by almost 300,000 cases per month just to get back to sort of the pre-COVID era. So that's a tremendous amount of volume to digest, and it can be very difficult to kind of restart everything after COVID and look at how you drive enough efficiency in your operating rooms and your surgery department overall to be able to safely redigest that kind of volume and also do it in a sort of an economically viable way, which Mr. Mohan did a nice job, I think, of highlighting that factor. So if we go to the next slide, we can dig into that a little bit more. So I think the key as we look at handling the current surgical backlog from an analytics perspective, first and foremost, there's a common misconception, I think, by a lot of the market that elective surgery is somehow optional. But really, elective surgery simply means that it's a case that can be scheduled in advance, right? So if I'm in a severe accident and have a trauma and have to go in and present into, let's say, the emergency department for an operation, obviously that can't be advanced scheduled. So that's emergent. And then there's obviously, semi-emergent. But the vast majority of the cases that were kind of put into backlog because of COVID are going to have to be put back on the schedule. And here's some recent research from kind of the April-May timeframe showing that in this large survey in the US, about 90% of all the cases for the people that were surveyed, about 90% said they're planning on rescheduling those procedures that were either delayed or during that time. And I think what's interesting is you can see the variation here in sort of the patient's level of confidence in when they would reschedule. And that ties back into the analytics need to be able to digest this backlog and create efficiency in the operating room, but to be able to create it in a way that is both safe for the clinicians and the patients, right? In a way that restores patient confidence in their safety, but also doing it in a way that is economically impactful for the hospital for exactly the reasons that Mr. Mohan cited just a minute ago, which is different procedures have different revenue profiles and different profitability profiles. And most of the hospitals, especially in the United States with the reimbursement system we have here, they've been heavily financially impacted by the cancellation of elective procedures because elective surgeries account for typically about 50 to 60% of hospitals' revenue and profitability, even though they account for only about 30% of the total case volume. And so these are all reasons sort of collectively why a strong analytics infrastructure in surgery is critical to be able to sort of speed and drive the recovery from COVID. And just sort of anecdotally, I would say that, in one of our programs that we ran specifically around COVID-related analytics on the recovery and restart side, in the first 2 weeks after we launched that program, we received over 500 requests from hospitals in the US for assistance. And then we started receiving requests from Europe. We started receiving requests from Australia. So there was a huge influx in new demand for analytics, specifically around how to kind of bring ORs back online and get back to normal. But more importantly, how to continue to manage the OR past that kind of restart piece and be able to digest that backlog, in both a safe way and an economically viable way for the hospital. So let me pause there and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Having understood the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the entire MIS ecosystem and its different emerging parts, it is time for one of the most awaited insight, that is, what is the possible recovery time required to overcome the current crisis? Mr. Devon, it would be great if you could provide your opinion regarding the same. Over to you, Mr. Devon.
Sure, thank you. And first of all, I think it's really important to note it is still very unclear as to when we can really expect normalcy in our industry and throughout the healthcare business. Although many countries are falling out of the exponential growth curve in the past weeks, as we've seen, the number of cases really continues to rise by large figures, especially here in the States, what we've seen in Texas, Florida, and California. For us in a global company, a few countries which witnessed drops from the exponential line also started to witness second wave of COVID-19 cases. So we've referenced that several times. Different parts of the world are responding differently. But with all of the healthcare systems really stretched and economies beginning to register heavy losses, we see countries are considering controlled reopening of their economies in different ways. So based on the evidence of a second wave of infections to be likely, our colleagues here at BIS Research have identified 3 key future scenarios which appear to be the most plausible, and as you see here on this graph that I'll speak to. Quadrant 1 is where the recovery rate is less than the incident rate, and there is a little impact due to the second wave. So there are 3 possible scenarios. The first scenario is in which the world moves from quadrant 1 to quadrant 2, where the recovery rate is higher than the incident rate. As you can see, there is low impact due to the second wave, which really means in case of a global second wave, it has largely been controlled somehow. And as you can notice, there's a recovery timeline associated with each of the scenarios on the right side of this graph. In scenario 1, we could be looking at the onset of global recovery by about the third quarter of this year, which would be fantastic. The second scenario assumes that the world will move from quadrant 1 to quadrant 3, where the recovery rate is greater than the incident rate. However, a second wave is beginning to have high impact on the healthcare industry, as we've already experienced. In case of this second scenario, the onset of recovery is pushed to the end of the fourth quarter of this year. And at this moment, BIS believes most of the world is moving towards quadrant 2. The third scenario is likely to be the most severe, in which the world moves from quadrant 1 to quadrant 4, where the incident rate is higher than the recovery rate, and a global second wave is creating more challenges with high impact. In case of this third scenario, we're basically looking at a prolonged fight against COVID-19, which could delay the onset of recovery to as late as the third quarter of 2021, something none of us want. It is really important to note that these are based on research done to date, and future courses of events could alter sooner or later than we can expect recovery. So let's go to the next slide. Continuing with those three scenarios that I just spoke to previously, BIS research has mapped out the course of economic recovery through the different quarters of 2020 and 2021, as you see here. In case of the first scenario that I mentioned, where the recovery is expected to be relatively quicker, we have already seen a downward trend in the global economy in the first 2 quarters so far. The outlook is expected to seem positive during the third quarter of this year, with slight upward trend in economic growth, which, although marginal, would indicate the onset of a recovery period with continued upward trend in the subsequent quarters. In case of the second scenario, the onset of recovery takes longer, with the first indications of recovery appearing only by the fourth quarter of this year. And in the third and worst case scenario, the downward trend in economy is expected to continue till the second quarter of 2021, with the first and marginal indications of the onset of recovery appearing only by the third quarter of 2021. So thank you to the BIS team for providing this insight. I hope those comments were helpful. I'll turn it back to you guys.
It is good to know that the MIS ecosystem would soon gain its lost traction. The growth in the volume of elective surgeries will definitely free hospitals from their current financial strains and significantly reduce the chances of bankruptcy. Moving on to the next phase, let us hear about the changes associated with surgical robotics, which are expected in the post-COVID-19 world from Mr. Mohan's point of view. Over to you, Mr. Mohan.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So, you know, a little tongue in cheek, is this a brave new world that we're going to be facing with surgical robotics post-COVID-19? I think, first off, the most important comment to make is that we do not believe that ultimately the long-term trends that are pointing to the expansion of MIS surgery and the digitization of surgery are going to end. In fact, there may be some aspects of this which humbly I think may actually expand. However, I think that we're going to have to think about it a little bit differently in terms of the way surgical robotics has been done in the past. So my first point is that I think we're going to see a change in how we view the surgical hospital. And there's going to be a further stratification between emergency and acute service and outpatient elective surgery. What I mean by this is robotics up until now has primarily been a tool to consolidate volume at larger facilities. And one of the issues that a lot of hospitals have is, do we have enough volume to, quote, justify, end quote, further robotic investments? And so these are kind of large pieces of capital. It's kind of a mainframe concept, and you're kind of sucking in procedures from some of the smaller facilities that may be out there. And I'll talk in a moment about outpatient versus inpatient, which I think is a very critical concept, and I'm sure other colleagues can speak to it. I think we're going to see, you know, basically the era of the independent solo hospital is essentially over, certainly globally, but in the United States for sure, with a lot of consolidation in the marketplace with hospitals. And so everybody's part of a network of some form, even if it's a 2 or 3 hospital network. There's just too many advantages to negotiation, physician alignment, and other sorts of things. And what they're learning is that there's a real value in not having every one of your facilities trying to be excellent at all things to all people. So I do think that, especially with the COVID lessons learned, that we're going to see a real push to outpatient elective surgery being held in facilities that are separate and different from emergency and acute service centers, particularly to take advantage of the needs that we might have as we've learned through COVID. I think also there's going to be a significant continued focus on value-based and cost-effectiveness analysis. I think the era of providing new technology that has an unproven benefit, I mean, and let's face it, new technologies are unproven when they first start. They're obviously need to be safe and show equivalency and effectiveness, but very often it hasn't been necessary to prove superiority versus the standard of care, because there's opportunities to consolidate the market, to grow share, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, I think given particularly some of the margin compression things that we talked about earlier and the cash considerations, I think there's just going to be a higher bar on value-based and cost-effective analysis in robotics. And, up until now, I think there's a question, is robotics part of the problem or part of the solution? I think the answer is both. And as much as possible moving forward, robotics is going to have to change the value equation to be a little bit more part of the solution. And that's going to put pressure on the cost per intervention. We simply cannot be adding as much cost as we've done in the past. And there's some new ways in which I think robotics companies, ourselves included, are trying to address that through reusability and reducing costs. And then finally, something that I put this picture in there for just illustration. For those of you who don't spend a lot of time in the operating room, there's a lot going on. There are a lot of people. I mean, you can't socially distance in the OR. At least everyone's wearing a mask. You don't have to mandate it. But it's a challenge. I mean, if you think about robotics in any other field of human endeavor, it's usually about eliminating the amount of human labor involved and providing machine labor to deal with something that's either highly repetitive or highly precise or both. However, up until now in robotic surgery, we really haven't fully addressed the issue of reducing staffing needs. But there are some aspects of robotics that really can do so. For instance, being able to guide the surgical camera system so that you don't have an assistant holding that camera system, that you can use the surgeon's controls to be able to do that. And you could even add the capability of machine vision and other things that certain companies like ourselves have invested in and brought to market, where you can add augmented intelligence. And so without getting too far afield on this subject, I'll just say, I think there's a lot of ways that robotics can reduce the reliance on staff in the OR, can make it so that the surgeon controls even more of the operation as they do now, and even more so, and reduce the need for labor, because that's one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing is just labor flexibility and labor shortages with healthcare systems. And I think it's time for robotics to step up and deliver on that promise. Next slide, please.
Indeed, value-based model is gaining importance among different healthcare ecosystems across the globe, and admitting that robotic-assisted surgery is considered as a luxury rather than a technology for better surgical outcomes. So we again would like to request Mr. Mohan to provide his opinion on the new area of focus for surgical robotics in the post-COVID world, and educate us about whether science fiction technologies such as long-distance telesurgery will be a real opportunity or not. Over to you, Mr. Mohan.
Thank you. A couple of slides just to discuss that question. I want to take issue with the comment about luxury. I think it's perceived as a luxury, unfortunately, in some areas, but take away robotic assistance in certain areas like urology, for instance, I think you would see a tremendous reduction in the availability of MIS surgery and the quality of MIS surgery. So, I agree, it's a perceived luxury in some situations, but it's becoming a necessity in certain areas because of the value produced. I would say that, the new focus areas during the impact, again, let's think about the tense I'm speaking of during, like right now. The first is outpatient surgery or lesser acute care settings. I kind of previewed this concept earlier. We're seeing many hospitals that previously sought to only invest in robotic systems in their main acute care or tertiary setting, if you will. Let's say they were a hospital network, because that's where the greatest numbers of surgeons are. That's where the greatest number of complex surgeries and specialties are. So you could take a piece of capital equipment like a robot and spread it around amongst a lot of different capabilities. What we're actually seeing now, and luckily at TransEnterix, we've sort of purpose-built in some ways our system to address this with high volume procedures at a lower cost, hopefully. What we see is that, you know, the outpatient surgery, whether it be hospital outpatient or surgery center market, is really where people want to come have elective procedures, and where hospitals can see those procedures done at a lower overall burden cost to them. So robotics has to play much, much more in outpatient surgery. And that's a big part of what our focus, and I think other people's focus, is going to be. And I would say, you know, I added this, you know, the American Hospital Association put out a report and it looked at revenue in 2018. And basically, inpatient revenue across the United States was only about 5 or 6% higher now than outpatient revenue, which is phenomenal. I mean, it was basically 80-20 when I, you know, began my studies and career. So it's changed a lot in terms of outpatient, moving towards the outpatient setting. And robotics as of yet has not fully embraced that. To your point about telesupport capabilities, I'll show you some of that capabilities in a moment, but there's no question that telesupport capabilities is a big aspect of our focus area during the COVID impact for a number of reasons, not just because of service and support, but also because, you know, so much of robotics has been driven by collegial telementoring and support, collegial mentoring and support, not yet tele so much, between expert surgeons or attending surgeons and residents and fellows. It's part of teaching people how to do a new way of MIS surgery. And if you're not able to travel and share best practices, speakers talked about earlier, whether it be conferences or having individual surgeons come and proctor other surgeons, many hospitals have proctoring requirements, you have to find another way to do that with remote technologies. Luckily, with robotics, you're turning things that are analog into digital. They're becoming zeros and ones, whether it be the visual field or the movements of the surgeon or other sources of information. And that lends itself very well to share if it's zeros and ones versus just an analog experience of just watching. We also feel like there is going to be, despite what I said earlier about some of those benign conditions that surprised me, I do think that there's going to be a heavy emphasis on oncologic conditions and the value proposition for servicing oncologic procedures with robotic intervention. I mean, that's usually an unquestioned area where surgical robotics is utilized. And so I think we're going to see continued emphasis on that. And we have in terms of what we see with the hospitals we work with. And then finally, I want to be a good steward of the overall space. And I will say that there's a number of players that are spending a lot of time on endoluminal applications. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, that's basically, rather than making a hole and being more invasive, kind of going through existing holes, primarily transoral or different procedures. And I do feel that in talking with clinicians and seeing some of the advances in that space, that's going to continue to be a focus area because you're talking about a radically less invasive treatment. And surgical robotics is almost a must-have in some of those interventions. So I don't see any reduction in that focus moving forward. Next slide, please. So to specifically speak of this, I think there's a new opportunity for long-distance telesurgical robotic technologies. And this may be where being in a digital environment with zeros and ones really changes a couple of things. You know, it's important to remember that when you think about how robotics started, and you go back to SRI and intuitive surgical and whatnot back in even the mid-90s, it was initially around remote surgery. So it really was about, you know, a person getting injured or a person needing surgical intervention and a surgeon being, you know, halfway across the globe and being able to provide that with very little nursing or corpsman support to be able to support that. It's a good theory, but it's never really been the real driver of this. particularly because of latency and just frankly, people want their surgeon close by for obvious reasons. However, I think that even though that new world I don't think is going to pop up tomorrow, and I think there's too many advantages to having the surgeon and the care team close to the patient. I think obviously robotics has been very successful without telesurgery from a long distance perspective. However, the opportunity in training, mentoring, and support is real and immediate with telesurgical operations. And so here, I apologize for the blatant self-promotion here with myself in this picture. Was the only one I could grab. But, here's a picture of our team working with our system with people in Europe. It's our director of training, Sarah Lazzaretti in Europe. Excellent professional. And she's guiding people in a lab halfway across the world on seeing what the intraoperative surgical view is. She's able to monitor it and share best practices, surgical video, documentation, whatnot, able to speak and communicate directly with a surgeon and see them at an operative cockpit, as well as, although there's not a lot of folks in the room here, but a lot of times there'll be a lot of folks circulating, nursing staff and first assistants, and being able to communicate directly with them and guide them when they're doing things at the patient's side. So it's an incredible opportunity to take telesurgery and really make it a community surgery, or and not have distance have anything to do with it. So I think this is going to change the training paradigm. We're going to have world-class trainers, whether they be surgeons or medical device training specialists, be able to communicate directly with hospitals without having those hospital people have to come somewhere. We're going to change mentoring. We're already seeing this happen with remote mentoring, and this is happening a lot with teaching and proctoring, and we're already being part of that and doing that. And then I think certainly other players and ourselves are looking at support technologies, right? We gather a lot of information and data about a surgery when we digitize it. And we have technologies such as machine vision technology, which is actually looking at the surgical field and extracting information from that. Already we've begun to make that a cloud-enabled feature. It's going to accelerate significantly because these technologies that help reduce the isolation that people feel where they're performing these surgeries without the benefit of everyone's knowledge. We have a world where we want to be able to eliminate that with machine vision, machine learning, and being able to extract data from these systems, as well as provide support without necessarily putting somebody in a car or plane to come and open up the back of a surgical robot. And these are all things that I think surgical robotics and network devices are going to be able to enable. So in the end, I would say this. There's no question that COVID-19 is a bad thing. It's an awful thing, and it has definitely been very disruptive to what we do on a regular basis. As my colleagues have said, however, we are seeing a nice recovery in the need for elective surgery because, as someone else said, elective is not elective, ultimately. It's just scheduled. I thought that was an excellent quote. And so we're going to get these things rescheduled, and we're going to do a lot of surgery, and we're probably going to be doing a lot more surgery than we otherwise would have done to catch up. And I do think some of these MIS technologies that other speakers are involved in, whether it be analytics or endoscopy or certainly robotics, and this here is I saw a question about this being the Senhance surgical system. It is, as example. We're going to see more and more MIS procedures done ultimately, and we're going to have to be more cost effective, more efficient, and more technically advanced in how we support our customers. And that's, I think, a lot of what we're trying to do. Thank you.
It is fascinating to investigate the future and imagine the telesurgical robotics being employed in reality. But we should also acknowledge that the surgical robotics, along with the few parts of MIS ecosystems, are capital intensive. And hospitals should overcome the current financial strain to stream their investments. Now, let us understand in Mr. Timothy's point of view on how the adoption of digital technologies will help hospitals to overcome their current financial state imposed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Over to you, Mr. Timothy.
Thank you. This is a big question, and it's a fairly complex one. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to answer it very succinctly. So I think as surgery technology supports hospital recovery, it's important to look at kind of the overall impact of the pandemic. And we've talked a lot about it today, right? There are some things that are short-term impacts. I think there are some things that are going to be kind of intermediate. And then there are some aspects of, our collective experience with COVID around the world this year that are going to be, really enduring drivers that are going to create opportunities and create kind of lasting change, I think, in healthcare and how it's administered and managed. I included a graphic in my slide here that's the result of some work that Dennis Kogan, Dan Eisenberg, and Eric Schultz did. And I think it's a really nice graphic to sort of look at, what the enduring drivers and medical technology are going to be and how that sort of ties back to where we view some of these opportunities to be. And I won't go into the whole diagram, but Dennis actually has, he posted this on LinkedIn. He has a LinkedIn newsletter. So I'd encourage you guys to, the people on the call, to maybe check that out, where he dives into this a little bit more in his recent newsletter. But what I pulled out of this in terms of, I think, our philosophy on it is there are three sort of key enduring drivers that are really going to promote hospital recovery. And I think hospital, kind of allow hospitals to thrive in the future because of some of the weaknesses inherent in the system that COVID has highlighted for us. And one of them is quality and risk management. The second one is efficiency and automation. And the third is real world evidence driven medicine. And I actually noticed somebody in the Q&A asked a little bit about, AI and machine learning and kind of where the trajectory is there. But these three, I think, are the three big ones that are going to really help hospitals to recover and continue to thrive and provide smarter, safer, more cost-effective surgery. And so when we think about quality and risk management, I think the key there is that there are more stakeholders sort of in sharing the risk than there have ever been before. And if we take the US as an example, right, we went through a long period of time where it was largely the insurance providers or CMS, right, the government healthcare system that bore the risk of quality, right? And then what we've seen over the last decade or so is that a lot of that risk has been transferred to the provider. It's been transferred to the hospital and the surgeons. And now what we're seeing is the hospitals are looking to say, well, how can I transfer risk down to the medical device companies or the manufacturers or the pharmaceutical companies? How can I transfer risk over to insurance, not from a payer standpoint, but really from a sort of a reinsurance industry standpoint. And so one of the things that we're really looking heavily at with Caresyntax is, how do we look at the economic ecosystem of the surgery and bring these stakeholders together and converge them, and then use digital surgery and technology and integration to help proactively manage the risk by ensuring better quality, right? And then everybody sort of benefits in that ecosystem because they're sharing the risk more equally and we're able to kind of proactively manage it. And then obviously we already talked a lot about sort of efficiency as a way to kind of digest in that volume, but there's also definitely an automation component in there in terms of, managing things like clinician burnout, right? Every physician and nurse that I know, and I know a lot of them, as I'm sure you all do, one of the key things they talk about is just the burden of documentation and the administrative burden that's been placed on caregivers that, not only burns them out, but takes them away from patient care. So I think there's a lot of opportunity through surgical technology and digital and IoT integration, like what Devin and his team at Fuji are doing, that can really help tackle this efficiency perspective and solve some major problems there. And then as we connect and really drive digital surgery kind of full ecosystems, what it's going to do is it's going to create data at a magnitude and I think at a level of richness that we haven't seen before. And this is going to drive the opportunity to advance AI, machine learning, really, sort of real world evidence driven medicine, which we've seen heavily in pharma over the last, 5 to 10 years. But I think the medtech area has lagged behind pharma a little bit. And I believe a lot of that's simply due to kind of the difference in those modalities of treatment and the availability of reliable data. And having a strong digital surgery ecosystem, I think, can solve a lot of those problems and really advance how we think about, data-driven medicine and personalized medicine. Back to you.
Having understood the benefits offered by the digital technologies, we would like to have your opinion whether the digital technologies will witness rise in demand due to the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. Over to you, Mr. Timothy.
Yeah, my short answer to that question is yes. I think there was already demand and growing demand, and the research you shared, and then what my colleagues shared, I think substantiates that there was already growing demand. But I think COVID, maybe what it did more than anything is it's kind of shown a flashlight on some areas where we're weak in healthcare. I think we've done a great job in healthcare of advancing treatment modalities, right? If you look at what we're doing, pharmacologically, if you look at what, the companies like TransEnterix are doing in terms of robotic surgery, companies like Fuji are doing, in terms of, and there's many others, right, in terms of advancing sort of the medical technology aspects of healthcare. Where we've lagged is on integrating those technologies and creating a foundational digital ecosystem. And, then what I love to do is, I love to compare what we've done in healthcare to other industries. And if you think about industries like military, if you think about security, if you think about aviation, these are industries that were pioneering digital ecosystems and digital integration 50 years ago, right? And there's a really powerful stat on here that I love. I mean, this is the US fatality statistics. If you go back 20 years in the US, with the exception of 9/11, right, which was an act of terrorism, there's been almost no commercial aviation deaths in the last 20 years in the United States. And when you look at deaths related to surgical complications, it's a flat line for the last 20 years, and it's actually on the rise in the last, 5 to 10 years, which is almost crazy when you think about the advancements in medicine that we've had, right? How can we have all of these great technologies coming into play in terms of direct patient care and still not be able to kind of correct that quality curve and bring the quality curve up and bring the cost curve down? And I think it's really because we're missing that foundational infrastructure. So I believe that COVID highlighted a lot of that for us, and I think this is a trend that's going to continue. I think COVID is going to help accelerate that. And I know in our business, we're already seeing it. I mean, the pickup in demand across the globe has been pretty profound, even as we sort of come out of Q2 and into Q3. So we're really bullish on the future. And I think we have some catching up to do with some of these other, sister industries that have been doing this for a long time. But I believe strongly that together we can get there.
Thank you. Now, let us understand how stimulus packages rolled out by several key economies will help in speed up the recovery of MIS ecosystem. I would request Manu on sharing your thoughts on the same. Over to you, Manu.
Sure. Thank you, Aditya. Let's understand US stimulus package first. We know that it has allocated $100 billion out of $2 trillion stimulus fund to healthcare providers. Now the question is how this amount will be utilized. The US has very privatized and fragmented healthcare system, and this is where things get a little complicated. For a pandemic like this, one of the essential tools to fight is the presence of single payer system like in Canada and the UK. It helps in streamlining the process. In the US, determining which insurance company is covering a patient is a complicated process, especially when the number of cases are growing exponentially. This results in very high administrative cost, which is around 26.2%. Out of the remaining $57.8 billion after directing investment for COVID-19 essentials, there is no clear estimate to how much will be used and by whom. The major concern is that no direct funding has been designated to support labs and diagnostic facilities. So thus the labs could be eligible for the remaining share. Considering that another hospital expenses, we estimate a maximum amount of around $15 billion only could be designated to hospital to reduce their financial strain. So in short, a very small amount can be designated for procurement of capital equipment, making recovery tougher. Next slide, please. Similarly, Germany's stimulus package allocated only $3.16 billion out of $83.51 billion healthcare funds, specifically for helping hospitals to overcome the financial strain, as you see on the screen. But the German stimulus package is well balanced and also possesses provisions for investments in healthcare ecosystem. The stimulus package allocated $11.30 billion to promote investments in healthcare ecosystem and $12.43 billion to promote investments in deep technology such as artificial intelligence. The $11.3 billion fund are supposed to help hospitals in building the infrastructure and capabilities. Hence, German MIS ecosystem is expected to witness a faster recovery rate. Thank you.
In the end, let us listen Mr. Devin's view on how leading economies are handling this crisis and what are different strategies to be incorporated to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on MIS equipment sales. Over to you, Mr. Devin.
Thank you again. And as a global company, as well as my colleagues here, we've seen really different situations around the globe the last 6 months. You've heard a couple times in the conversation already the different types of payer models that the US uses versus Canada or the EU. And for us in the US, being a profit-based industry mostly, we're really now in a situation where a lot of the profit-based hospitals are in a situation where to maintain profitability, they've had to furlough critical staff and even had to reduce cuts in a time when we need them the most. So hopefully with the kickback and the rise of surgical procedures, we'll see that return to normal. Culturally, it's been really interesting as a Japanese-based company. Asia was clearly much more prepared for this pandemic, and that does stretch into MIS and into the healthcare delivery system as a whole. We've seen significantly less of an impact in our home country of Japan and in the Asia market than we have here in the United States. One other interesting note that we've seen around the globe is the regulatory bodies have definitely shown a willingness to flex. And one obvious example that we saw throughout the news and in our business was new entries for medical device manufacturers such as Dyson, who's famous for making vacuum cleaners, came out with a ventilator within 67 days. Overall, amongst a lot of our MIS peers and colleagues at other organizations, we've seen that the large, diverse portfolio companies are weathering this storm better versus the single device that are for single procedures only, maybe in one type of MIS elective surgery versus others. And as was noted previously by Mr. Mohan, remote technologies are here to stay. And I can say on behalf of Fujifilm, we're really happy to be on the forefront of this. And all the MIS manufacturers are really going to need to adopt on how to utilize remote technologies, not just from a service standpoint, but also in terms of virtual sales rep and virtual training that's going to be required. And we're really happy to be partnering up with Caresyntax on their virtual rep program because we think it's something that's going to be a game changer for the MIS ecosystem. I want to move to the next and last slide there. So we thought about how to represent some of the strategies to to minimize the impact on MIS equipment sales. And we used just some of our own personal examples. And one of which is minimally invasive surgery towers. So there's over a dozen companies that manufacture MIS-based towers. But there's only 2 companies that are manufacturing multimodality towers, which can really transform functionality according to need. So you could use both a flexible scope and a rigid scope in this example. And as capital dollars become more scarce and much more prized at each of our customer sites throughout the MIS ecosystem, we really think the value analysis committees are going to start considering the ability to use technologies in more than one format and function. I had already mentioned in the top right the use of remote technologies for sales and support. It's a huge initiative that we have at Fujifilm, being a medical informatic company. We think we're really on the forefront of that, and working with Caresyntax, we're excited to deliver that. The bottom right, vendor neutrality has been talked about since MIS started. The need to have all these different equipment manufacturers working together. And we're really hopeful that this is a reality coming to be now. There's been a lot of great work at many institutions around the world, including the activities of the OR, the future at Mass General, for example, on interoperability. And we really think that the time is now to see this come to action. And then the bottom left, we just gave a couple examples of all of us in the manufacturing of the MIS ecosystem are going to have to pivot with new guidelines and COVID trends. And these were just two simple examples. Going into surgery now, a lot of chest x-rays are being done to check for status of COVID. And we had an application at Fujifilm that actually allows for an AI algorithm to be able to predict the condition of lung x-rays, as you can see on this patient x-ray here. Another example was intubation. So intubation has a huge increase for the anesthesiologist to pass on COVID from the patient to the anesthesiologist. And so anesthesia organizations are actually now recommending that nerve blocks be tried to be used in place of intubation. And so ultrasound point of care, such as products like Sonocyte, are now being used to do nerve blocks where traditionally intubation was done. So just two good examples of how I think all of us in the manufacturing area of MIS surgery are going to have to pivot to meet those new needs. So I'll turn it back over to the BIS group.
Thank you all the speakers for your valuable insights on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the MIS technologies. After your inputs, I can say that several organizations in the healthcare industry will incorporate the suggested way to navigate through the current crisis. And also, we very well realize that the COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed the potential of digital surgeries. Hence, different stakeholders of MIS ecosystem can capitalize this new trend. With that thought, let me conclude today's session, following which I now declare the forum open for any questions from the listeners. I would request the listeners to kindly type in the questions in Q&A box available on the bottom of your screen, and I will be happy to pass the question to the speakers today. So we have our first question for Mr. Devon. The question is, before COVID-19 world, the MIS ecosystem was starting to capitalize on technologies such as AI and AR. Will this trend continue and get stronger in the post-COVID world? Over to you, Mr. Devon.
Thank you, and I think the quick answer is yes. From our standpoint, we've seen AI really help, again, just using one example of chest x-rays and allowing the radiologist to be able to prioritize using AI. And we feel that's just the tip of the iceberg. Tim Lance and his group over at Caresyntax are using AI for surgical training and performance outcomes. And I think we've seen a whole host of other organizations in our space generating AI to improve efficiency and safety. So yes, we think it's going to continue to grow strong. Thank you.
It was a great answer. Thank you. So our next question is for Mr. Timothy. The question is, do you foresee any regulations being enforced by the government to promote incorporation of digital technologies? Over to you, Mr. Timothy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the regulatory environment is definitely a factor to consider here. I think what we've seen is there's definitely differences, kind of region to region. I think in the U.S. there's been a little bit of a track record of the last few years of kind of more deregulation around digital technologies. You think about things like the 21st Century Cures Act and some other government enactments here. The intent has been to kind of open up the regulatory environment. so that we can get more data, so that we can drive some of these sort of systemic benefits. And I think we've seen, Europe and some other areas around the world, China's done this kind of relative to COVID, where they've actually relaxed, at least temporarily, some of the regulations, not just to promote incorporation of digital technology, but to really promote sort of innovation around, both handling COVID as well as kind of strengthening the overall healthcare sort of ecosystem. So it's something we're definitely keeping a close eye on. But at least in the near and intermediate term, I think we've seen a little bit of a relaxation of some aspects of the regulatory environment. And then there's others with, MDR in Europe, where there are going to be some devices around digital technology that may go up a class. But overall, I think the regulatory environment seems pretty friendly right now around this.
It was an insightful reply. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have now run out of time. In the end, I would really like to thank you all for joining us in this session. We have got awesome responses through registrations and questions. With the help of speakers, we will try to answer this question and send it across through mails. With this, I conclude today's webinar. Thank you everyone, and I wish you all have a wonderful week ahead. Thank you.